the experience of finding a mythic form that really suits you very well is absolutely an opening experience. It's not the end point of your path of discovery. It's so corny, but it's like it's the beginning. It's the first step that you get to take. Welcome to Soror Mystica, a podcast exploring life's mysteries and magic through its symbols.
I'm Mariana Lewis, an archetypal tarotist.
And I'm astrologer Cristina Farella.
And just as the Soror Mystica guided the alchemist through his holy work, we hope to be your mystic sisters in these conversations, guiding you deeper into the symbolic life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Soror Mystica. We are here today to talk about living your personal myth.
Yeah, this is such an exciting topic. This is something that Christina and I are so passionate about, both of us. And I wanted to start this episode with this quote that I've held for myself for a long time by Madeleine L'Engle, who is the author of Wrinkle in Time. And she says, "When we lose our myths, we lose our place in the universe." And I remember the first time I read that, I kind of got like this shudder because I was like, why is that so true? What is it about mythology and our personal myths that really place us in the universe, in our lives? And what does it mean to live our personal myths? What does it mean to live a myth at all? So that's what we're jumping into today because we are very ambitious people.
We are. We both have Saturn ruled ascendants, so we just try to do the most for no reason, but all the reasons at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's fine. I love that L'Engle quote, and I loved that whole series when I was younger, and
Yeah.
I think it's a really fascinating idea. It's so simple, right? To lose our myths, we lose our place in the universe. So
Yeah.
we obviously live in a world that doesn't really prioritize the primacy of myth and its role in our subconscious minds, in our emotional experiences. And so I think today, one of the things we want to try to explore is how to support ourselves in rediscovering our own mythic path.
Yeah.
And there are many ways to do that, but we'll kind of get into what that means for us as contemporary people living in a really disenfranchised world and how we can sort of re-enchant and revivify that mission.
Said so beautifully, as always. I first kind of discovered my love of mythology when I watched Joseph Campbell's Power of Myth series, which I've talked to you about a lot. I think you actually have my copy of it.
Yeah, I have it. I stole it.
I love it.
On my shelf.
That's good. I'm glad.
Sorry.
Well, no, it's good because it's such a great series, and if people haven't watched it, please go watch it. I don't know if all of it's on YouTube, but I know there are clips out there. So go look it up. The Power of Myth with Bill Moyers on PBS. So I first got that series. My grandpa had recorded it off the TV on his VCR and given me his recording. And I watched it and I was like, oh my God, this changes my entire life. And I mean, I'd always loved mythology as a kid, just reading the stories, but there was something about the way that Joseph Campbell talks about what myth really is, the meaning of it and the numinous essence of it, the way it connects the entirety of the universe. It is so special. It really kind of stimulated a new intellectual and spiritual and emotional path in my life that has brought me here to study the tarot and study Hermeticism and all the things that are so passionate in my life. And I know you have a similar kind of love and devotion to mythology.
Yeah, I had like this really vivid experience where in seventh grade, we did like our mythology unit in English class. And I was so taken with it because I just was like someone who was always convinced, kind of maybe dorkily, that there's just like magic everywhere. It's like trees are magic and birds are magic and,
'Cause they are.
The ocean is I was just very much of that mindset, even as I got a little bit older, like into middle school. I don't know, you think you kind of grow out of that, but
Mm-mm.
I did not. And now here I
Mm-mm.
am, which is fine, which is wonderful. But in that unit of this mythology class, I just became obsessed with the idea that really, like, the earth was numinous and that there were different gods for different topics like love and hate and wisdom and nighttime and dreaming,
Mm-hmm.
all of these things.
Yeah.
And I actually, like, I remember getting into a fight with a boy. We were sitting at like this like four top table thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up, like, and this kid that I happened to be fighting with was Italian and Irish like me
Mm-hmm.
and raised very Catholic like me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this is just, it makes so much sense. I remember saying this. And he was like, what do you mean? This is bullshit. This is like, there's only one God. And I was like, no, I have a feeling that when you wake up in heaven after you die, you're going to see a lot of different gods. And
Oh,
he was
wow.
like, you're weird. And I don't know. I just like that memory. I probably embarrassed myself. It's burned into my brain. And so I just have it now. And so thank you to Miss Dillon, who was a wonderful seventh grade teacher. I don't know where she is, but one day I'll find her and thank her. Um, and so, yeah, that's how it all started. And then, yeah, I don't know. Here we are.
You declared yourself in seventh grade. That's perfect. Um, so I think that we probably should define myth, right? And
Hmm.
actually define our terms, as we say in the
Hmm.
academic fields. So you have like a really good quote, right?
Yeah, we've got some quotes here. So it's hard to define myth because obviously myth is something that's always existed. And depending on who is talking about myth, we understand it differently. And so I think we can say that myths are ancient stories that humankind all over the world cultivated to maybe grapple with and describe their experiences. And so, maybe to put it, a little bit more eloquently, I have a quote from Karen Armstrong, who writes, "Myths give explicit shape and form to a reality that people sense intuitively. Myths tell us how the gods behaved, not out of idle curiosity or because these tales are entertaining, but to enable us to imitate these powerful beings and experience divinity ourselves." I think
Hmm,
that's really great,
that's so
right?
good.
Because, yeah, we have these essential, I would say, truths that come through in myth. And
Mm-hmm.
the stories of the gods and their mortal counterparts are not necessarily moralistic tales, but they are examples of really concentrated versions of experience that
Yeah.
we can sort of align ourselves with, right? So maybe to kind of expand this a little bit, Edward Edinger, a Jungian, super brilliant. I'm reading that book right now. Uh, he puts it very simply, and I'll paraphrase because it's kind of a long paragraph, but he says basically that myths express metaphysical truths and give answers to the basic questions of life. That's cool. But then he makes
Mm-hmm.
this point that, again, depending on who you are, your approach to myth is different. So scientists
Yeah.
will see myth as a primitive form of explaining nature or a primitive,
Yeah.
science. Philosophers and theologians may see myth as a primitive or inferior kind of religion. To historians, myths may suggest the occurrence of actual half remembered historical events like
Mm-hmm.
wars or invasions
Right.
or cultural takeovers. And then, my favorite point for artists and poets, mythology provides what Edinger calls a treasury of images to be used in their craft, providing endless fodder for the imagination. And so
Yeah.
that's, I feel like, where we find our alignment with myth. And I love
Yeah.
that idea as well. So, yeah, I hope that that fleshes out a term. It's such a small, tiny word, it's weirdly hard to define. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
It is. I love that so much. I was actually I've been pondering just that. So now I'm gonna have to read this book, obviously. Um, but I've been pondering recently, you know, why we orient ourselves so there's so many different ways to orient ourselves toward myth. And one of the things that Kimball says, I've been listening to his lectures that he gave in the 60s and 70s. By the way, check out the Pathways podcast with Joseph Campbell's lectures. It's very, very, very useful. So in one of these lectures, he was like, the modern thinker wants to take myth and explain it away and explain how we've risen beyond it and above it. And I think that this is one of our greatest failings, and that's what Campbell was arguing too, that this is exactly not the point. The point is not to rise above the myth. The point is to experience the myth and experience the deeper meaning of it. He's saying, well, no, we actually need to see it the way that they saw it in the beginning, which is that these are symbolic stories communicating something profound. And so this is what we do with myth, and it is still vibrant and it still has so much meaning and purpose in today's world. But we don't see it that way, which is absolutely, it breaks my heart. So I think that it's important now to talk a little bit more about how we've lost our myths, because that's really what we're talking about when we encourage people to find their personal mythology or to live through the mythological lens is to reclaim it, to recover it. And I really think that so much of what we've lost is because of the patriarchal mindset of empiricism and scientific thinking. Obviously, we don't want to throw out science. We just also want spirit. We just also want to allow room for what is enchanting and is mystifying. And I think that in this hyper empirical world that has developed over the last several hundred years, we really haven't known what to do with myth. And this is kind of the crisis of the contemporary West that a lot of thinkers have been talking about for a long time, that we have kind of hit a crisis of meaning. This is what Jung talked about, Campbell talked about, like basically every existentialist philosopher has touched on. Where is meaning? I want to talk a little bit about Rollo May. He started the field of existential psychology. Or psychoanalysis, I think. And he wrote a book called The Cry for Myth. And so he has this quote where he says that a myth is a way of making sense in a senseless world. Myths are narrative patterns that give significance to existence. Myths are like the beams in a house, not exposed outside view. They are the structure which holds the house together so people can live in it. And he kind of explains that without these beams, without these myths, the contemporary society that we live in has kind of become broken, cracked. There is this fundamental structure that we're missing underneath it, and so he argues that this is why we have so much anxiety and guilt, and why we're constantly kind of feeling out of touch, or we're feeling like we don't know how to make the choices we need to make in our lives. And I think that is such an interesting way of trying to make sense of why modern society, like living today, feels so hard. I think about this a lot. Like, was it always so hard to just be alive? And I know we have technology and we have so many complicated things in society today, but I really do think that there's a big point in what May is saying, that we have lost something fundamental that makes living bearable and meaningful. And so that's why we kind of feel fractured all the time. I just went on a whole tirade there. Sorry.
I love it. I think it's wonderful. And I, of course, totally agree with you. And I think if I could add anything there, two things kind of came to mind while you were talking. Number one is something that we could literally do a whole other episode on, which is the importance of ritual in myth, which was,
yes.
right. So for, I think, just to back up a moment, myths exist because they were tied to rituals. There wasn't just a book of mythology floating around in the world in ancient times, no matter where you were, that had the secrets of like the gods. These myths existed because they told important stories, usually tied to seasonal shift, agriculture, cycles of death, and
Mm-hmm.
then looking for
Right.
renewal. And so, a great example of that is the Eleusinian mystery cult that
Mm-hmm.
existed
Yeah.
in the ancient Mediterranean that told the story of the disappearance of Persephone and the mourning of her mother Ceres or Demeter. And so that story in particular is an agricultural rite, probably
Mm-hmm.
also a spiritual rite, a dark feminine rite as well, but that's also about honoring the earth, who is a
Mm-hmm.
dark feminine entity unto herself. But my point is, you can reach really far back into history and you will find stories that have the same shape as what we know as the Persephone myth. It's not something that just miraculously came to life in ancient Greece spontaneously. It is the holdover from other agricultural myths dating very, very far back into history. And so, in that
Right.
Rolome quote, where he's saying that myths are like the structure or the beams of the house, and the exterior of the
Right.
house therefore might be painted different colors or have different kind of window treatments or whatever. The structure remains the same. And so I think that that's an important note for us, for those of us trying to
Yeah.
like rekindle our mythic connection. It's not arbitrary, it's not meaningless. These stories and their shapes were embedded into our psyche for a very long time in human
Yeah.
history. And now, maybe we can transition into how myths got lost and how maybe
Yeah.
even, mythical thought got pushed aside by something called enlightenment thinking, which brought us again a
Enlightenment.
lot. It brought us a lot of progress. We are not here to trash the Enlightenment completely, but what the
A little
Enlightenment,
bit.
what it did wind up doing was really denude the world of any sort of orientation to magic, the feminine, in
Yeah.
support of logos, empiricism, and things that have brought us important change in the world. But we need our magic.
Yeah, we can't throw out the Enlightenment altogether. Obviously, we're not attempting to. Don't come at me. I understand it was important, but it also was just such a tragic time for the for the mythological tradition. I think I remember in grad school we didn't take this class together. I think you had moved away already at this point. You'd moved to Oregon. I
Sad.
know, it was sad.
Boo.
But I was in an enlightenment class. Oh, I remember actually you were like, I will not take that. And I was like, that's probably for the best.
But I tried to, and the guy who was teaching it didn't show up for the first two sessions, and we sat
Oh my
there,
God.
and I was commuting from Brooklyn, from
Mm-mm.
far Brooklyn
Yeah.
into Midtown to get there, and he did that twice, and then when he showed up, he was like, "Yeah, this class is going to be really reading heavy and really intense. I'm really not available for any like feedback." And I was like, "I
Cool.
gotta go. This is not
Bye.
correct." So the subject matter plus also, I mean, I wanted to take the class, but yeah, it was just a
Mm-mm.
weird.
No, I had a different professor, and I remember texting you because I was like irate one day because we had been talking about who even knows what we were talking, some Rousseau or whatever, and I brought up Robert Graves, who I love so much and you love so much, who is a really interesting thinker, and he has a lot of beautiful ideas about mythology. The White Goddess is his very famous book. And I just got like bombarded with people being like, how dare you bring up this person who is not validated by academia and all this stuff. And I was like, but you're very boring and I hate this. And I was really, really angry about it because I was like, why can't we bring up the academic ideas that are a little bit on the edge of what is empirically provable, but extremely exciting in a in an imminent way almost. In this, there's like this reaction of the heart that says, oh, that is something really to dig into. And that's exactly what
Mhm.
mythology draws out of us. So in that Enlightenment period, we were so ingrained in empiricism, in provability, in logic, that we lost connection to that stuff that is a little bit difficult to communicate.
You know, there are many arguments that we can have around defenses of enlightenment or defenses of, pre-enlightenment thought. And I think just to make that split explicit
Yeah.
to people, like up until, the Enlightenment, which is the 18th century, we find like a world specifically, and I'm talking about Europe basically. That's where my
Yeah.
historical brain has its most of its education. So, we're not talking about all of humanity here, but the Western world, and its
Yeah.
innovations up until the Enlightenment period was a world that did take into consideration things like herbalism, astrology. In order to be a
Right.
doctor in 17th century England, you had to know astrology really well. It was part of the curriculum of liberal arts education. And in that space, as a result, there was room for all kinds of other practices. I've studied like herbal arts and stuff from this era, very important, very prominent. And then with the sort of Copernican revolution, we
Mhm.
discovered that the universe does not revolve around the earth, but actually revolves around the sun. And in that, everything falls apart because
Yeah.
once the whole view of the cosmos disintegrates, we have to really rework our understanding of what's true and what's false. And so the emphasis became very much focused on what's empirically provable, scientific theories, and moving
Mhm.
forward in a way that prioritizes what's logical. And so, of course, what we wind up doing is, we lose connection to anything that is deemed irrational. We also see, tools like midwifery and doula
Mhm.
support for women
Yeah.
really get kind of excised from academic situations. Men took over, obstetrics and gynecology, and so there's just like this not to put too much of a gendered split on it, but there is this sort of
It is.
right, yeah,
Mhm.
a
Yeah.
schism we can say.
There was. I mean, at the time, they were still trying to figure out if women's brains were capable of holding as much knowledge as men's brains. Like they were still
Yeah.
studying the difference of the brain, and they were pretty sure women couldn't. They were
And
literally could not figure it out how to hold knowledge and information, and so they can't learn anything.
totally.
So yeah,
And it wasn't all fine and dandy. Like I believe, in that era as well, medical textbooks would say that women's, like our uteruses float around our body,
yeah.
and like that's why we're crazy because
Still
we're
believing
connected to the
that
moon. Yeah,
from like 1,000 years ago, that was still the common belief is where's the uterus? Well, it must be in her shoulder today because she's really out of it.
she's being a bitch today, so it's not a good day for her uterus, right? So I mean, and yes, but like also it's not moving. So I'm also I feel careful of just saying that we have had many leaps and bounds, but the sort of the sort of social or ideological orientation to myth and to the numinous really changed in this
Yeah.
period of time.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that one of the words you use, which is really important, is logos. This is like a very important dichotomy in archetypal thinking and Jungian thinking of the split between logos and eros. Logos meaning in Greek the word, which is associated with reason, and then eros meaning love and connection, relationship, desire. And so these two words are the words that Jungians use to describe the split between the masculine and the feminine, and it's kind of archetypal perspective. And so the Enlightenment era was really about the progress of logos, of thought, of reason, of rationality. And so eros, of course, was going to be repressed in response to that. And that's what I really think birthed the Romantic movement, the kind of radical response to Enlightenment thinking, which was the very intense return to eros and poetry and beauty and desire, and mythology too, and so that's where we get all these gorgeous paintings and sculptures and all the incredible art that came out of that period, and poetry, and all of it is so dedicated to the divine essence that's in mythology. So much was inspired by that, and so we've been reclaiming it since then. I think it's been coming back, but we still can't let go of this hyper empirical thinking all the time, which seems to say that we can't have mythology and science coexist, which I don't agree with.
Mm. Yeah, I think that John Keats is my boyfriend, so I love. I think is he a Scorpio? I think he's a
Oh,
Scorpio.
probably.
Um, uh, but we still live in a world now where we haven't really recovered from that split of the enlightenment, or the severing of maybe logos and eros, or
Yeah.
the insistence on logos over eros, right? And so I think that that's what we see a lot of the times when we meet with people, probably usually a first time client who
Mm-hmm.
is really interested in trying to discover their story through their chart or through the
Yeah.
tarot or through anything else. And they are feeling stuck because they know that there is something more than their experience has maybe shown them, or maybe there's more to life than what people have told them
Yeah.
exists, right? We live in a really alienated world. It causes a lot of discord, it causes a lot of loneliness and, dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think our modalities of astrology and tarot are so important for
Yeah.
bringing in, right, the to reinvigorate that mythic vision. So, yeah, how do you feel like you see that come
Uh,
through?
it's such a big thing. I feel like going back to that idea of Rollo May, who basically says, well, we can't really be healthy, well-adjusted people if we don't have a mythology, and we're not connected to mythology, and so we're always going to be kind of in this state of anxiety and tension and guilt and confusion, and I've been reading tarot a long time, and it took me a while to realize that people don't actually come to me asking a question like, oh, do I get back with my boyfriend or not? Like, that's always the surface level thing. People come to me asking, who am I inside my life? And what is it really about? And who do I really want to be inside of it? And this is where their personal mythology is missing. And so they come to some kind of a point, a crossroads, a stuckness, and they don't know how to navigate that tension because they don't necessarily know how to connect to that intimate mythology of who they are. They don't necessarily know how to connect to stories and legacies of our past that offer us that wisdom as well. And I do think religion is a really hard thing to talk about in the modern world because it really is complicated. But our mythologies for our ancestors, for the large part, came from the religious context. And something that you said earlier that really got my head spinning and thinking was that we've lost our rituals. That's part of losing our mythology, and inside of religion, that's kind of what it offers us, the mythology and the ritual, these two things coexisting together. And that's one of the things that Campbell says a lot, is that when we literalize it, when it's like, well, did this really happen? And is it the right date and all these things, then we totally lose the point of it. But for most of us modern spiritual seekers, we're not working out of a very, clear religious system. We're kind of like, well, where are our mythologies and where are our rituals? We kind of have to make them up for ourselves. And so, if we're not looking to a Christ figure, for example, who has a very set and clear known mythology, then part of our mythology kind of has to come from our own lives, from our own stories. And that's a really enormous and sometimes dangerous task to undertake. But I really do believe that's why clients come to the space with the archetypes of the tarot and with the archetypes of astrology, because they're like, well, these things already have their mythologies. Maybe I can find mine through the thread that they already hold. And I think that is literally why we do the work we do, which is why it's so great. And I
Mm-hmm.
love it so much. And I'm so happy that I get to do it and grateful because it's that important. I really think it can be that important. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just get a reading and we're like, okay, that was nice. But I'm sure you've had that experience where you're sitting with someone and you can see them like awaken to themselves in that moment. And it's a very profound thing.
Oh, for sure. And I think like that it's so overwhelming to try to figure out, say you're someone who wasn't exposed to mythology necessarily. I think that the topic seems daunting because it's old, it's
Yeah.
kind of archaic. There's a lot of like stuff about warriors. Like sometimes people just aren't attracted to it. And so I think that what the myths do is, obviously they give us symbols because we don't have to hold hard and fast to the figures that are in these stories. What's important is to think about, again, like the shapes that they make and the shapes that
Yeah.
they leave in our psyche. And I think, I believe this is James Hellman, another really simple, good quote is that myths do not ground, they open.
Yeah.
And I really love that because the experience of finding a mythic form that really suits you very well is absolutely an opening experience. It's not the end point of your path of discovery. It's so corny, but it's like it's the beginning. It's the
Yeah.
first step that you get to take. And so rediscovering your own mythic path, and maybe we can talk about what that actually means for people
Yep.
in practical terms. I think it looks a lot like letting yourself be exposed to stories, to paintings, to poetry, and looking for patterns. We have to be pattern finders when we're thinking about
Yes.
mythic experience and how to kind of see yourself in those stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
So think about your favorite movie. Why does it move you so much? Is the character a hero? Or is the character a really lovelorn person? Or is the character a hedonist? And what happens to them? It doesn't have to always come from Robert Graves' book of Greek mythology, although that's a very good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it can be as simple as trying to identify the archetypal kind of residue of the forms of art that you love the most, because
Yeah.
myth is in every single piece of art. And if a piece of art doesn't have a mythic shape in it, I don't know, it's probably not that satisfying. Maybe that's my own bias, but
Yeah.
it's impossible to escape.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's a good first step for those, who are listening, who are like, okay, like mythology's cool, but I don't really care about the Trojan War. Do I have to really think about it? Like
Nope.
why? Hmm.
You just made me
Yeah.
think of this very delightful quote from Campbell from one of his lectures where he says, if you ask an artist what his painting means, if he doesn't like you, he'll tell you.
I love
Because,
it.
because the point is that you find yourself in it. And if you can't find yourself in it, it's not for you. Right. And it's the
Mm,
same idea with mythology. If you're reading a myth and you don't find yourself in it, it's maybe not yours. It's maybe not something that has something to say to you right now. And that doesn't mean it won't ever. But I think that the tarot is such a great place to do that mythological exploration of discovering what your mythology is, because the tarot is, in my opinion, the chart of the journey that we're all taking, the mythological journey we're all on. We start with the magician who has all the materials on his table and says, all right, let's go make a life. And then we pass through those archetypes of masculinity and femininity, love and power, all these things. And then with the chariot, we really start the movement through self-discovery of saying, who am I? What is the story I'm on? I am now leading the chariot, which is the symbolic, it's the symbol of life itself, the movement of life. And we're going to direct this forward and try to get to the world, to get to this end point where everything comes together. And we pass through I tend to think of the tarot in a few different stages. And when we start with the Chariot, we pass through this stage of developing the ego. And the ego, whenever I say ego, I always want to clarify, because I don't mean like your self-centeredness ego. I mean the Latin word for I, the sense of this is who I am. I know it. And so we spend some time in the tarot developing the ego, and then we have to disintegrate the ego. We have to pull it apart. Then we hit the hanged man and we're like, all right, now we're hanging upside down. We don't know what's going on anymore. Then we pass through death, and then we meet the devil, and we really have to shred ourselves into 1,000 pieces in order to find out who we really were to begin with. And then that's those final cards of the tarot. And I always like, whenever I talk about the arc of the mythological arc of the tarot, I always like to end it with the Fool. And I think that a lot of people want to start with the Fool, obviously, because we kind of very cutely are like, oh, it's taking the leap. It's like, starting the journey. I don't think the Fool comes at the beginning. And I think it's because you don't really know what journey you're on until you get to the Fool. And then once you realize you're on it, then you're reinitiated into it. And so I think that we have to be constantly passing through our mythological journeys to reinitiate ourselves to that Fool over and over again. Oh, right. This is the story I'm living. Oh, right. This is the person I really am. And so I have to live by that no matter what circumstances are facing me. So I think that that's one of the places that we can get started discovering our myth. I mean, we're going to pull cards. It's not going to tell us, well, this is like the great destiny of your life, but it is going to tell us this is the mythological moment you're in. You're facing the moon, right? You're facing the place of being lost in the night sea journey, or you're with the Chariot. You're being guided towards this point of saying, I am it. I am living the life I'm meant to. And so I think that that's, whenever I think about how to direct people towards this mythological way of thinking, start with that. Start with the cards. Get a deck. Play around with it. Find the power of that, and it will really start to stimulate things.
I love that. And I love this idea of the Fool and the world being like
Yes.
necessary for each other. That's another reason why having a sort of handle on archetypal insight or mythic forms or the shapes of astrology, the shapes of tarot feel really important to just have in the back of your brain. And we don't need to like walk around the world applying mythology to every single thing that we see. This, I think, again, remembering that myth is connected to ritual, which is what gives life meaning. We're not here to
Yeah.
impose this on every single experience we have. We need to search for the mythic forms in stuff that challenges us, or stuff that inspires us, or stuff that asks us questions. So I think that a lot of the challenge of self-mythologizing is that we also say, well, who am I to associate myself with these
I
big
know. Yeah.
topics or with a goddess or with, a figure. On the other
Oh,
hand, there are tons of
yes.
people who are like, I am the goddess, so
Yes.
there's
I
the
am
split,
Lilith reborn. Yeah,
but
I know.
that's a whole other topic. Yes, that's we can't go there. But I think for a lot of people, especially those starting out, and maybe people listening who are like, I'm interested in this, but I just who am I to do this? It sounds so grand. I would say it's absolutely not, because like we contain all of the signs of the zodiac, like we contain all of the archetypes of the
Yes.
tarot, you contain all of the gods inside of you. And tapping into a different god form in astrology, right, means embodying the vision of that piece of psyche. You are able to do that. You are able to drop in with Saturn when you really need to hold a boundary. You're able to drop in with Mars when you're able to be brave or make a decision or cut something away. And that is our right, basically, as humans,
Yeah.
I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And interacting with those figures, those archetypes, is living these mythological moments. Of course, it's not gonna. Our stories are not literally gonna be that we go, and have to pick up a sword and free a princess. That's not how life is. But we do have to, pick up the sword of discernment and protect the parts of us that are vulnerable. And even though that is a mundane experience in the lived life of saying, well, I guess I have to create a boundary, or I guess I have to sit with this vulnerable part of myself and understand what is actually vulnerable in this moment. It is this mythic work to do that, to understand it. And sometimes putting it in that grander scheme can actually infuse the meaning of that moment in us, because a lot of times we just go through our lives and we're just like, oh, it's just happening and just got to get from point A to point B. But when we pause to say, what is this moment I'm living? There was a theme like on Instagram and TikTok like a little while ago of like, you have to romanticize your life, and everybody's like taking videos of themselves like with a really moody filter, like drinking a cup of coffee. And I kept thinking like, this is like actually a very nice little thing that people are doing, a trend, but we should mythologize our lives rather than romanticize them. Because when we get into these moments, like for example, do I quit this job or not? Like, what do I do in this situation, which feels so ordinary? What we're really doing is deciding what is the greater path I am yearning to follow. This is the quintessential crisis of the hero at a fork in the road. If we envision that moment for ourselves, even doing some active imagination or just some visualization work of saying, well, okay, here I am. This is actually what it is. I'm on at this fork, and I could go here into this kingdom or there into that kingdom, and which do I choose? It feels so much bigger because it is big, and we have to give our lives that opportunity to feel big sometimes, so that we don't just rush past the experience of living them.
I love that. I love that so much because I do think that we tend to write things off sometimes in our lives, like, oh, things are really hard right now, but whatever, my life just sucks. It's like, yeah, maybe you're going through a really challenging period. Maybe you're having a really hard transit. However, where can we look to examples of other figures, other characters who have moved through similar experiences? Because you know, not to say, well, what's that phrase? There's nothing new under the sun. Like we are living
Yeah.
these experiences that are archetypal, and even though the details may shift and the intensity may wax and wane, this is part of being human. And so to say, this is a mythic moment that I'm in right now, this crossroads, this potential, this potential breakup or this potential marriage or this potential travel that I have to do, we can see it as this bigger picture moment. And that gives us a sense of
Yeah.
meaning, in my opinion. So I think that the not romanticizing but mythologizing our lives is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really great idea.
Yeah, I but we also have to think of like the other side of that too, which is our tendency to exaggerate our ego as hero, which is a little bit sticky territory to get into, but I think it's very important because when we do mythologize our lives, when we do think of ourselves as the hero of our lives, we run the risk of becoming ingrained in the ego perspective, crowning ego as king. And so the point of mythology is to teach us things. It's to teach us how to live. Like no myth is just like, hey, here comes the hero and he's so great and he wins everything. Congratulations, the end. The hero has to fight challenges and has to learn things and has to fail. That is the point of living. That's the point of mythology. And so when we just focus on, well, this is what the way my ego is experiencing this story. I am victimized in this story, or I am righteous in this story, and there's no way I could be wrong. Then we lose the opportunity to actually learn the lesson that the myth holds for us. And I do think that in all myths there is something to learn. We don't want to think about it as a moral necessarily, because that's a little bit, kind of closed and we thinking of it that way, but there is something to learn. And I think that that's the point when we're mythologizing our lives, is to always ask, what is this moment teaching me? What am I learning from it? We're always developing. So that's part of this work as well. We have to remind ourselves of that.
Yeah, totally. I think that it's easy to get addicted to our stories, and you can do that with or without mythology. And so, kind of like,
Yeah.
in our first episode, we were talking about dream symbols and how, for periods of time in our life, a dream symbol will be really, really potent and will show up a lot in dreams. But when the charge of that vessel kind of dissipates, maybe when we move through the complex that created that dream symbol's potency,
Yeah.
it disappears or it fades from our view, and so something changes. And so I think that that is, a really important piece to kind of keep with us. I also think that one of the challenges of sort of re-mythologizing or even, yeah, reaching into the sort of mythological past these days is that we are still very much under the kind of umbrella of enlightenment thinking where we want to apply
Yeah.
rationality to these stories. And so I see a lot of, and this is not negative, but I see a lot of taking mythic content and applying to it the language of contemporary psychological approaches like CBT or something like that, which
Mm-hmm.
is fine. It's a tool. But I do think that we are missing the point when we only approach the myths through this is the psychological story and this is how we fix it, right? We don't want to fix. I just love this idea of not letting or not trying to fix the neurotic person, right? That's that Jungian
Yep.
idea. I'm obsessed with this. As a
Yep.
neurotic person
Don't fix
myself,
the
yeah, leave me
neuroses.
alone. No, the the idea that we should not try to take a scalpel to these images and to these ideas and to try to put them into the boxes
Yeah.
that they certainly can't.
Yeah.
They're too big to fit in, right? So I
Yeah.
think that that's just a personal. I think we share this
Mm-hmm.
perspective that it's just we cannot.
Mm-hmm.
We have to remember that sometimes we have to trust Eros, I think, in that
Yeah.
experience.
Beautifully said. How did you put it the other day? You said it's making it clinical.
Yeah.
It's taking the mythology and making it clinical.
Mhm.
And we don't need it to be that. The mythology is not supposed to fix our lives.
Yeah, I think, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking a lot about how, as an astrologer, to offer some suggestions on like letting astrology help you find your so-called mythic path. And so,
Yeah.
um, I would just like to share, I guess, an idea or two, and then I'll describe this style of reading that I love to work with people in,
Mhm.
which, yeah. Okay, cool. So, okay, just some ideas just off the top of my head. I think that looking at the very basic positions of your sun, moon, and chart ruler in your natal chart can give you very cursory insight into what kind of mythic path you are walking. The
Mm.
sun, as the sort of source of ego, can describe what kind of mythic hero or heroine you are on your journey. Is the sun above the horizon? Were you born in the daytime? You have a diurnal journey. Are you a night chart person? Is your sun below the horizon? You have a nocturnal journey. So play
Mm.
with those details and see what's there. Same thing with the moon. The moon can be like the asset of, like the hero's heart, what's guiding you on that path. The sign placement, the house placement, its aspects, all that normal stuff can sort of, looking through this perspective, yield some interesting ideas. The chart ruler, too, talks about what really is pulling you forward. So where does your chart ruler sit in the natal house sign and aspect wise? This might describe what initiates your journey or what the driving force of your journey is.
So cool.
Yeah, it's neat, right? So play with
Yeah.
that, everybody, and see what you come up with. And if you come up with anything cool, we both would love to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love how you're such an earth sign and you're like, "Okay, let's give people things to do. Let's give tips." And I'm like, "Let's talk about God." I'm over here like, let's go into the underworld and make it more and more complex. Um, it's
We're a
perfect.
great team. I want to talk
We
about
are a really
God,
good team.
but I want to talk
No,
about
you
like
do. But you're also like, but let's live in the real world. So I'm like, what real world? That doesn't
what's God having
exist.
for breakfast? Like what's going on? How does he nourish? How do they nourish themselves? Okay.
I think
Okay.
if God were having breakfast, he'd have whole wheat toast with butter, and then a side like a hard boiled egg. This is what I imagine. I've thought
Wow.
about this before. Can you tell?
That's so weird of you.
Isn't
God's
that so
breakfast
weird?
is toast with a hard-boiled egg. I have not thought about it before. I think that honey figures prominently into the breakfast situation and like really brightly colored fruit. And I don't know. Yeah.
You
some
have a
kind of
much more
green.
flamboyant god than I do.
I love that. That's wonderful. So this is another way of discerning your mythic path. What kind of god do you have in your brain,
What does
and
he
what
eat
does
for
he have for
breakfast?
breakfast? Yeah.
Or she?
Yes. What
What does she have
does
for
the god
breakfast?
form have for breakfast?
There you go.
Um, I love it. Okay, cool. So another just random idea, and this actually kind of helps me segue into answering your question for real, is to look, I would say, after you think about sun, moon, and rising stuff, engaging the fourth, eighth, and 12th houses of your natal chart, which I call the houses of psyche, can be
Mm-hmm.
really interesting for doing this kind of work, because that is going to talk about the ancestral motivations in your life. That's the fourth house. The influence of power dynamics and shared resources in your life. That's the eighth house, and shadow. And then the 12th house being how you connect to the collective unconscious. What is really your take on the bigger picture, right? So these are
Yeah.
just interesting ways in. And then the final technique, and the one that I rely on primarily, is working with mythic asteroids. And so this,
Yeah.
again, is something that deserves its own conversation, but in your life, I know that you all listening have like two or three favorite stories
Yeah.
or favorite myths. Find the figures of those stories. If they are random movie characters, try to do some research and figure out what kind of like mythic hero are they aligned with, or mythic figure, or tragic
Right.
figure, or
Yeah.
whoever.
Yeah.
Um, there is more often than not an asteroid named for that figure. Put it into your chart and see where it sits. I guarantee you it's in a prominent position in your natal. And this is a way of affirming to you that particular essences of these mythic stories are really important for you. You could back your way into it if you have a fancy astro software tool like Astro Gold or Solar Fire. You can literally see what asteroids are connected to particular parts of your chart. And so, in my own practice, I offer something called the Mythic Visions reading, which is a two-part session, two 1 hour sessions held a lunar cycle apart. And we are really there to discover exactly what we've been talking about today. What myths are important to you and why? How do they show up? How can you more deeply connect with them? And so, I work with the asteroid figures, first and foremost, to identify patterns in the chart. Who is a daimonic figure for you? Who is guiding you forward in this lifetime? And there are so many thousands of asteroids that, this could be a very exhaustive, overwhelming search. I let my clients guide the conversation, because I don't see myself, again, as like the keeper of secrets. I think my clients are wise. And if they're drawn to the Persephone myth, I want to know where Persephone is, the asteroid in their chart. And it's always
Yeah.
somewhere important, right? So it's a kind of like, it's almost like we're kind of letting divination in, because we're guessing a little bit at
Right.
where these pieces might land. But more often than not, it yields really exciting insight. And so, if you're looking for that kind of support, come find me. I'd love to work with you. But in general, you can do this on your own too. Astro.com has a really good free asteroid tool that you can use to look stuff up. So, yeah, that's how I love to bring myth into astrology. And I started doing that this year, when I started really teaching about myth and thinking about how to let people see their own mythic versions of themselves through their natal chart, instead of
Yeah.
it just be like, what kind of job should I have, and how do I
Mm-hmm.
find a good partner? These questions are important, but letting what is mythically relevant be known to you and
Right.
discovering that is just so empowering, I think. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
my myth spiel.
I love that you have that offering. I think it's such a beautiful, beautiful thing, a beautiful idea. And you know, I know that it's really good. So I highly recommend checking it out if you are interested in it at all. Like it's really worth it. So go do it. So before we close today and say goodbye, we are going to continue our little series of pulling the symbol. So as we mentioned in our first episode, we are going to invite our listeners to drop us a dream or a synchronicity or something that has symbolic meaning to them, to kind of work through what do we do with it? What is it? What's the essence in it? So let's jump into it now. If you're enjoying this podcast, we encourage you to learn more about how you can support us on Patreon. There's many benefits available, including extended episodes, guided tarot meditations, and astrology transit journals. But all listeners are welcome to share a symbolic experience for us to explore on the show.
Therefore, we invite listeners to pull those symbols from their lives, whether they come from a dream or synchronicity.
Thank you to today's sharer, and please tell us your symbolic experience on our website, sorormysticapodcast.com.
Are you a small business looking to reach a targeted audience of people who are interested in things like spirituality, esoterica, obscure academia, holistic living, magic, the occult, or other related topics? If this sounds like you, Soror Mystica would love to invite you to become an advertiser on our show. As Soror Mystica has a highly tailored audience of mindful, curious, depth-seeking listeners, we would be delighted to be able to give your business a place to reach new eyes, new ears, and new hearts. If you're interested in becoming an advertiser, you can find our application form at our website, which is sorormysticapodcast.com/advertise with us. Thank you so much for being a part of our listener community, and we really look forward to hearing more about your unique business quite soon.
Tangerine Sage Healing is a serene capsule for Reiki healing and gentle intuitive guidance for those who are seeking relief and newfound inspiration. Founder and Reiki master Stephanie Curtis offers an array of different in-person and distance Reiki healings for realignment and revitalization. Feel free to discover more about Tangerine Sage Healing or book a session by going to tangerinesagehealing.com or visiting Tangerine Sage Healing on Instagram. And I can personally vouch for Stephanie. She has given me Reiki many times and is so good at what she does. So go check out tangerinesagehealing.com. So I am going to read this entry, the submission, and it is not a dream. It's actually a synchronicity, which I'm very excited about. Our listener says, I've been reading tarot mostly for myself for about 6 years. Recently, in a lot of readings I've been doing for myself, the Chariot has popped up. I've been thinking about moving and starting fresh. And so one day, not too long ago, I did a reading where the Chariot popped up, and I had no idea what it meant. So I stepped away from the cards and sat outside to think. And a white dog came up and barked at me. We stared at each other for a moment, and he left. I watched him join up with a darker colored dog and walk up the road side by side, and I realized I was looking at the Chariot. It was almost mind-boggling. The tarot is truly extraordinary. I agree. I think the tarot is truly extraordinary. It's so perfect. I was so spooked when I read that because it's such, if you don't have an image in your mind of what the Chariot card looks like, first of all, go Google it, learn it. But also, it's basically this dude in a chariot, and he has two sphinxes, horses, oxen, depending on your deck. And they're almost always white and black, or a light color and a dark color. And so this is like the very traditional image that we have of the chariot, of like this one person in this chariot pulled by these two different colored beasts. And so the question, of course, is like, what does that represent? What is that synchronicity? I think that people ask me this a lot. Like, what does it mean when a card keeps coming up? And I'm like, it means that it's here. Like, it's going to keep coming up. It's not some big mystery that, there's something to do. It means that it's still relevant. It's here. It's really trying to get your attention. And so with the Chariot, we're certainly talking about that sense of I. That I always say that the question the Chariot has found an answer to is, who am I? I think that with the light and the dark, the symbol of that is very classically this idea of what is shadow and what is consciousness, right? So we have this duality of being in control of both our conscious direction, the light, which is like, I am this, I see it, it is in the solar territory, and then the darkness, which is in that more unconscious territory, what is underneath the surface, was a little bit more in shadow, which is also just as equally drawing us forward.
Beautiful as usual. And, when I think of experiences like this, just to sort of stay with our listeners' experience of like seeing a light colored dog and a black dog, like appear out of nowhere, I do think that once we start working with the tools of any sort of divinatory form, we're kind of opening like a little door in our psyche that says, I'm inviting in
Yeah.
possibility to be contacted by something that's greater or more numinous. And so even if it's just to say, yes, this is a kind of reaffirmation of the card pull that you received, but also I think it can be seen as a sort of a nod
Mm-hmm.
from the
Absolutely.
universe, like, I'm listening to you. Let your desire be known, or I'm here supporting you. You pulled that card, it's confusing, I know you're
Mm-hmm.
confused. Here's the symbol again,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to keep working it together. And I think that that's a really important thing to also just accept. And it sounds, I mean, I think our listeners are people who would be open to that sort of thing. But if you're on the fence, if you're still a little bit of a skeptic, which is healthy, um,
We
it
will convince
is,
you.
we will change your minds. And it is something that you will notice, and you will notice in your
Yeah.
most rational moments. It's just simply true that you will see, symbols that seem like they couldn't
Mm-hmm.
possibly have landed right in front of you, but they do. So,
They do.
mhm.
I think that with especially since the chariot has not been clear, right, to this person, they don't quite know what it is. Whenever we have a synchronicity where we don't know the meaning of the synchronicity, or we know it is powerful, but we don't know exactly why, our task is not actually to rationalize our way through it. A lot of times what happens is unconscious. And
Mhm.
I try to remind people of that a lot, because we can feel it when we have a synchronicity. It's not just like, oh, that's funny, it's 11:11, that's cute, that's sweet, very nice. But we can feel something in our body, certain, like getting all worked up. There's something that kind of like jingles. I don't know why that's the word that comes to my mind. Sometimes the task is just to sit with the feeling of it, rather than be like, oh, let me intellectualize my way through this. What does the chariot mean? Let me read 18 chapters on the chariot. Just, what does it feel like? What was the feeling that happened? How did that strike you? And this is, we'll probably have an entire episode on synchronicity. But synchronicity, the thing that connects it is meaning. Always, it's meaning. It's not, oh, this is a sign to do this or to do that. It's always just like, well, why was it meaningful for you in that moment? Because you know that this whole moment for you mythologically is the chariot. This is the mythological moment you're in, asking, who am I? So I
Mhm.
have a recommendation for you, dear listener, who submitted this one. This is the activity I always assign people when they have the chariot and they don't know what to do with him. You're going to get out a journal and you're going to ask yourself, who am I? And you're going to give a paragraph answer. Then you're going to take a breath, get a drink of water, come back, write it down again. Who am I? Write a different paragraph. You have to say something entirely different. Okay, go away, take a breath, come back. Do that at least 8 more times, minimum of 10 times. And every time you write a paragraph, it has to say something different about you. You have to answer it a different way. And hopefully, by the end of this very exhausting and irritating activity, you will get to something that surprises you, that has information you didn't know was there. And that's what the chariot wants to act upon. So go do that, see what happens, and good luck. Thank you for joining us in our conversation today.
Please consider supporting the podcast by leaving a review and following Soror Mystica wherever you listen.
You can also become a more active supporter and a member of the Soror Mystica community by joining our Patreon.
If you have a symbolic experience that you'd like to share with us for the podcast, you can tell us all about it at sorormysticapodcast.com.
The music for this podcast is written and performed by me, Mariana Lewis, with special thanks to Stefan Lewis. You can connect with both Cristina and myself on Instagram and get to know our work by clicking on the links in the show notes.
As the alchemical motto goes, as above, so below, as within, so without.
May this ancient wisdom continue to guide you deeper.
Until next time, take good care.